Hello AS, welcome to Biological Psychology. This is your final approach that you'll be looking at, so let's get straight into it. The key assumptions of the approach are that every behaviour has a physical or physiological cause. So behaviourist approach say all of behaviour is caused by environmental stimulus. Cognitive approach says all behaviour is controlled or developed through internal mental processes. The biological approach says it's physiological causes, and those things are listed there, and these are the ones that are mentioned specifically on the spec. The influence on behaviour, so always link it back. I'll give you some examples that aren't this, but always link it back to human behaviour. So make a note, human behaviour we're talking about. You can make reference to animals, but ultimately it must be about human behaviour. Genes, biological structures, and neurochemistry. So, hereditary, if something is hereditary or heritability, it means passing on characteristics from one generation to the next in your genetic makeup. So there's probably some traits that you have inherited from your biological parents, that for some of you, if you live with those parents, you'll be able to identify those. So you think, oh yes, mum always does this, dad always does this. And this is where, and already you can be starting to think about the fact that you might live with people who aren't biologically related to you, or you might be different to the people around you in some way, and this is where we start to come and think about nature versus nurture. And of course, so far we've looked at nurture with the behaviourist and social learning theory. Now we're going to look at nature, which is more the biological theory, and what we're trying to work out is how much is nature and how much is due to nurture of a certain behaviour, and twin studies can help us with that. There are two types of twins, some of which you might have come across before. Some of you might come across this before. Monozygotic or MZ twins and diazygotic or DZ twins. MZ twins share 100% of their genetics and 100% of their environment. We're assuming if they're raised together in the same environment, which is the assumption we're making at the moment. DZ twins, 50% share 50% of their DNA and 100% of their environment, assuming that they all, that the two twins live in the same environment, which we are doing for now. So the only difference, as you can see, all of those boxes are 100% apart from this 50% here. So the only difference between MZ and DZ twins that are raised together is that DZ twins have less similar DNA. So the only difference is nature, not nurture. So remember that. The only difference between MZ and DZ twins is nature, not nurture. Nurture is they share the nurture. Concordance rate. This is something we talk about in twin studies. We study them, and that's the probability that if one individual has, for example, an illness such as mental health needs such as schizophrenia, the chances the other person will also have that mental health need. So it's expressed in a probability. So if I took a twin and they had a condition, how confident could I be that the other twin also had that condition? Okay. For example, if the concordance rate in MZ twins for schizophrenia is 50%, that means that there's a 50% chance that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other will. With DZ twins, it's 15%. So there's a 15% chance that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other twin will have schizophrenia. So you can see from MZ and DZ, there's a big difference. Bear in mind the only difference between MZ and DZ twins is nature. So what does that tell you about this piece of research in schizophrenia? Same with aggression. If MZ twins, the similarity, so if one MZ twin has a high level of aggression, then it's an 87% likelihood the other MZ twin would as well, and vice versa. So if one MZ twin had a low level of aggression, there's an 87% that the other twin would have a low level of aggression. DZ twins, 72%, and exactly the same here. MZ twins, if one MZ twin has an eating disorder, it's a 44% likelihood the other twin will have an eating disorder, and DZ twins, 12.5%, if one has an eating disorder, there's a 12.5% the other twin would have an eating disorder as well. So thinking about concordance rates, and going back to MZ and DZ twins, the only difference between an MZ and a DZ twin is nature. That MZ twins have 100% of their DNA, a pair, and the DZ twins, they have 50% of their DNA. So the only difference between a pair of MZ twins and a pair of DZ twins, if you compare the MZ and the DZ twins with each other, is the MZ twins have 100% of their DNA and DZ twins have 50%, so they are different. So we're using the concordance rate, and in an exam you would never ever just quote the MZ concordance rate or the DZ concordance rate. We need to know both, because it's comparison between MZ and DZ twins. The bigger the difference between an MZ and a DZ twins concordance rate, the more that trait is due to nature. For example, intelligence, MZ twins it's 88% and DZ twins it's 66%. These are made up figures. The previous ones weren't, but these are made up figures to illustrate a point. There is a 22% difference, which is pretty big. It's a fairly large difference in concordance rates between MZ and DZ twins, so that trait must be due to nature. However, there are still some environmental factors. We never completely rule out environmental factors. Okay. In antisocial behaviour, the difference between MZ and DZ twins is 5%. So it's more likely that antisocial behaviour is due to nurture because there's a smaller difference between the two concordance rates. However, there are clearly still some genetic factors. The same with depression. MZ twins, it's a 50% likely concordance rate. DZ twins, a 20% concordance rate. The difference is 30%. The bigger the difference between MZ and DZ twins, the more that trait is due to nature, whilst there is still some environmental factors. So in your book you will see, got those. Although again, then we look at these concordance rates again. So aggression, 15. There's a 15%. So there's a fairly large concordance rate, a fairly large difference. So aggression is has some genetic influence, but also some environmental. There is a very big difference in eating disorders between MZ and DZ twins and concordance rates. So eating disorders can be said to be very closely linked, or more closely linked, to genetics. There's no particular percentage that is one or the other. You just look at the percentage and you see if it's quite big or quite small, because you'll never ever have something that's just nature or just nurture. So if it looks like a fairly large percentage, then you would call it a fairly high influence in genetics, whereas if it's a fairly low percentage, then you would say it was more due to environment, the difference. Next key term, biological structures. An arrangement of parts to the biological structures is an arrangement of parts to form an organ, system, or living thing. This is nothing new. The brain is made up of several lobes. You already know the different lobes, so that's a biological structure because it's many things put together. The nervous system is made up of many things put together as well, as you know, because I regularly get you to draw the flowchart for that. And the endocrine system that you've done with Andy is many different things put together, different organs put together. And then you can see some of the behaviours here that the brain controls. You already know about them: the frontal lobe, higher order thinking, occipital lobe, visual, and so on and so on. So you already know the impact the brain has as a biological structure on human behaviour. It can help us think, it can help us see. And the same here with the endocrine system. The nervous system. So you've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. They are systems, biological structures, and that's the impact they have on our human behaviour. So tense muscles, heart beating faster, more anxious, more alert, and so on and so on. You already know that. Neurochemistry. There are two types of neurochemistry we're going to look at. Neurotransmitters, which are mostly found in the brain, and you know about neurotransmission and how that works within the synapses, and hormones, which are generally found around the body, more around the body. The way that neurochemistry has an impact on our brain is that and these are just two examples. Serotonin is called the happy hormone. Low levels of serotonin can lead to depression and OCD. And then dopamine is another neurotransmitter, something you would find in the brain. High levels of dopamine can lead to schizophrenia. Hormones, if you have high levels of hormones, a chemical within your body, so hormones, body, neurotransmitters, brain, brain, chemical within your brain. Hormones, which are around the body, are testosterone. High levels of testosterone can lead to high levels of aggression, low levels of testosterone, low levels of aggression. And oxytocin influences our behaviour by encouraging social bonding. When as soon as we're born, mothers have a huge rush of oxytocin. After we've had sex, we have a huge rush of oxytocin. When we hug someone, we have a huge rush of oxytocin. So oxytocin encourages social bonding, and that's how a biological thing, such as neurochemistry, influences our human behaviour. Then we have geno and phenotypes. So the genotype, this is how our genes interact with our environment. So this is how they work together. Genotype is our actual genetic makeup, what our genes are made of. And phenotype is how that trait is expressed. So how is it influenced by the environment? So it's genes and environment working together. An example of this is known as called PKU, and the full term is I'm pretty sure is in your books. PKU, they have a genotype. People with PKU have a genetic mutation that causes PKU. So their genotype is there's a genetic mutation which causes it. However, Whether that's expressed or not is based on their phenotype, so the interaction of gene and environment. So their phenotype, whether they express that trait or not, so how that trait is expressed, whether it's expressed or not, depends on if their diet is or isn't controlled. PKU is easily controllable as a child if you are fed a certain diet. So, genotype is that they have a genetic mutation to lead to PKU. Their phenotype is what is actually expressed, and this is a really good example here. Oh, apologies, this is an example. So this is what I've just been talking about. So a really good example here would be person 1 has no symptoms, so their phenotype, they both have the same genetic mutation, the same genotype, but due to interaction with the environment, person 1 has, their phenotype is that they have no symptoms because it was controlled by diet, whereas person 2 has symptoms of PKU. Their phenotype is that they have symptoms of PKU because there has been an because their diet wasn't controlled for, and you can see some examples here, and here is a good example. There is I believe a brother and sister, and obviously the sister has the genotype. They both have the genotype for PKU, but the sister's phenotype isn't because of her phenotype, because of the interaction, she doesn't express the symptoms of PKU, whereas her brother does because the environment is because his phenotype, he does express PKU because his diet wasn't controlled for. Okay, lots and lots of examples of genome phenotype. Hair colour, so someone has a gene for brown hair, that is their genotype. However, how light or dark or light their brown hair is, so how whether it's dark brown or light brown, depends on the interaction of genes and light. So the interaction between the environment and their phenotype, the way that trait is expressed. So if they live in Australia, they'll have very, very light brown hair, and if they live in England, probably, then they'll have very dark brown hair, and that's how it's expressed. They could never, ever, ever have blonde hair, and they could never, ever, ever have black hair. And we don't talk about hair dye here. We assume hair dye doesn't exist. Don't ever fall into that trap. Because they have a genotype which limits them, but then within that limit, phenotype has some control over how it's expressed. Height. Someone has the gene to be very, very tall. Genotype is tall. However, how tall they get depends on interaction with their genes and environment, so their phenotype. If they're malnourished, they'll never feel the full potential of their gene. If they still have the tall gene, they will still be tall, but they won't be as tall as they could be. Or somebody short with a short genotype, no matter how well nourished they are, they'll never become 6'5". Skin colour, someone has a gene for very, very fair skin, so that's the genotype. However, how fair it is depends on gene interaction with the sun. So again, their phenotype, that interaction. And weight, someone who has a gene to retain fat, so that's their genotype. However, how much fat they retain, how fat they become, depends on their environment, if they have access to diet and exercise. Same with freckles, genotype for freckles, but their phenotype is how it's expressed. Their phenotype depends on the gene and the environment interacting. Evolution is survival of the fittest. So you can see an image there, and hopefully you've heard of that with Darwin. You're probably familiar with the concept of survival of the fittest. So individuals with the most adaptive behaviours are more likely to survive and reproduce. All animals want to go on, and all animals' aims are to survive and reproduce. Adaptive behaviours are behaviours that help animals, humans, individuals, everybody survive and reproduce. People who have adaptive behaviours who help them survive and reproduce, are more likely to survive and pass on their genes to the next generation. People who do not have adaptive behaviours are more likely to die and not pass on that characteristic, and therefore the species evolves to be more adaptive as a whole species. And the example here, natural selection, is the idea that first of all there were some green bugs and there were some orange bugs. However, the orange bugs had the most adaptive, had a more adaptive behaviour than the green bug. The orange bugs were harder to see against the background, so they are more likely to be eaten. The green bug gene dies out because it's not adaptive. The orange bug gene continues because it is adaptive. It helps them survive, helps them reproduce, and eventually you can see the species evolving. So there's the green, there's a mixture of them here, and then eventually it becomes orange, or it talks about brown there, because the brown gene, the brown adaptive trait has helped them survive and reproduce, and all of the green animals didn't have an adaptive trait, so they died. Okay. The way you want to talk about evolution, your exam answers, is through this process. You want to, first of all, in the exam, you'd identify the adaptive trait. Giraffes have the adaptive trait of a long neck. explain why this trait is adaptive. They developed this because food was scarce, with leaves only being on the top of the trees. What does an adaptive trait ensure? The giraffes with the longer necks were able to reach more food. These giraffes were more able to survive and reproduce, passing on their genetic propensity towards having a long neck to their children. If you do not mention passing on their genetic propensity towards having a long neck to their children, if you do not mention passing on their genetic leaning towards a long neck, then you will to their children, you will not get the marks. And then what happens to those without the adaptive trait? Those without them can't reach the leaves and therefore aren't able to survive and do not pass on their short-necked gene. Okay, same thing again here. The peppered moth identify an adaptive trait. Identify the adaptive trait. An adaptive trait the moth developed was to be darker. This was adaptive as it assured moths couldn't be easily identified against the sooty buildings of the Industrial Revolution, so they were able to hide against the buildings. Take this further. Explain why this is adaptive. This allows the moth to escape the beady eyes of predators and survive and reproduce, therefore passing on its gene for darker colouring to its offspring. So passing on the gene to the offspring, you must mention that, who are also more likely to survive and pass on their gene. Then you explain what happens without. Moths without this dark colouring would easily be identified and eaten. Okay. Next one, mussels or Asian crabs. Identify. The mussels have evolved the adaptive trait of thicker shells, where there are Asian crabs. This is adaptive that make the mussels harder to eat. The thicker skinned mussels are more likely to survive and pass on their genes. So identify, explain, expand. Without the thicker shells, the mussels are more likely to be eaten and cannot pass on their genes for having a weak shell. So you must mention about, take it to its full conclusion, the fact that they would pass on or would not pass on their genes. Medium groundfish. Identify. The medium groundfish have evolved the adaptive trait of smaller beaks. This allows them to eat smaller nuts which were ignored by larger birds, meaning they didn't have to compete. This ensured the survival of the smaller beaked ground finches, so they could pass on their genes for a small beak. Without these small beaks, they had less access to food and would therefore be more likely to die, not passing on their genes for larger beaks. In class, we are going to look at the examples of human examples of evolution. So we're going to look at phobias and biological preparedness. We're going to look at fight or flight and why that's evolutionary, and sexual selection as well. I am going to create another video with the A03. However, because these are quite large videos, I'm going to break them into two chunks. So this is the A01. I need you to complete both the A01 and the A03 for homework in class this week, for next week. So please make sure you access the second video as well.